Welcome to the Daily Wrap-Up, a concise show dedicated to bringing you the most relevant independent news as we see it from the last 24 hours. Well, thank you for joining me yet again, my wonderful critical thinking vagabonds. I was actually planning on doing this show much earlier today, and I was essentially trying to wait for the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing with Peter Strzok to end. Essentially, it's been ongoing for hours, as I think right now it's even in recess and it's going to be continuing on. Truly one of the most embarrassing displays from both sides. I mean, clearly, if I had to say, I would feel like at least from the argument of the right side, they're basically claiming that what happened was wrong, and I do agree with that, but it just seems like such a ridiculous partisan display from both sides, as if the Republicans can pretend that these things never happen on their side of the aisle. It's just a ridiculous joke, as the other side continues to force all of this Russia discussion, calling about we should be investigating immigrant children, while children are dying all around the world due to the policies they allow to continue to happen. It's very frustrating to see, and I'm glad that some people are covering it, but I continue to put out that is essentially a big theater. It really is one big farce being put forward to continue to distract us and to continue to get us looking other places, while I can argue that probably nothing will ever truly come of this, if for any other reason that the Congressional Committee is so wildly split down the middle on partisan sides. Facts be damned. It doesn't even really matter what's happening here. They're simply going to fall in line with their side, and this is how we're going to continue to see it play out. So I was trying to wait for that to essentially end. Seems like it's going to be going on for a very long time. So ultimately, there's a few good things I want to get into today. And I want to start by apologizing for those of you that might have been trying to look at the website this morning. I've been discussing on and off about probably the last 3-4 days about how the Last American Vagabond website has been under attack. Both my hosting company and the people that help me in the background ultimately have no idea what's really going on here. We keep finding all these different glitches and things that keep popping up, and the site just keeps going down, and for no explanation ultimately. And it's been on and off down all day today. So I apologize for that, but it's something that we shouldn't be surprised about. I've been talking about this a very long time, how we're going to continue to see these kind of attacks. We're going to continue to see these kind of manipulations on anyone trying to apply critical thinking to what's going on and really think for themselves, which is the opposite of what they want anybody doing. And that being said, apologies for the website. There's also other manipulations going on today. Some Brian Richmond on Twitter, who's someone I follow and someone I work with a lot, has brought to my attention. And I already heard of this coming. I didn't know it was taking place today, that essentially we are seeing what they're calling the Twitter purge begin today, which is a very interesting concept. And it's something that I think we all should be very much aware of. And it's very subjective at the end of the day. Now, ultimately, Jack's tweet says, this week we'll be removing locked Twitter accounts, locked when we detect suspicious changes in behavior from follower counts across profiles globally. The number of followers displayed on many profiles may go down, with really no way of knowing who gets knocked and who doesn't and who's still there and what the kind of random concepts were around why these people got left. Ultimately, my account specifically went down from about 6,000 plus to now under 3,000 followers, which is not, like I told him, not really that shocking to me. I've continued to see my follower count stay pretty much the same or even go down, despite an ever-growing amount of people continuing to follow, which honestly I don't care much about. I'm not really a big proponent for Twitter. I think I use it like all of these because I feel like I need to access and reach the people that are predominantly using these and still lost to the mainstream mechanism. However, I'm not really concerned about what Twitter chooses to say my followers are. I know who you are out there, and I know how much you appreciate what I'm doing. But this is a very funny thing to see, that how this is just this arbitrary deletion of accounts they deem are suspicious with no real information to go along with it. Now, that being said, I'm only covering this to get to this next point. Truly, I think Twitter is increasingly irrelevant in what's really going on today. But it just so happens that while they're Twitter purging all of these different accounts, guess what accounts just happen to remain on Twitter? These kind of accounts, which unfortunately, the account has now been set to private, because it was brought to our attention that there was multiple, and I did see them for myself, multiple, nothing but underage girl profiles on this Twitter account that essentially were talking about, in sexual ways. I won't get into too much gross detail. And so this was brought to our attention by Brian Richmond specifically. And we all began reporting it, talking about it, and of course they put their account to private, to protected, that is. And despite the fact that we've continued to report this and talk about it as often as possible, and for a period now, it's still very much there, which should show you while they're purging Twitter and deleting all these accounts they deem suspicious, despite the fact of very tangible, obvious evidence of pedophilia and manipulation and just gross violations of their actual guidelines, this kind of account remains. Now, luckily, that's probably the wrong word to use there, thanks to people like the Honeybee who documented this before they took their page down, we do in fact have a shot of some things that were on their page, such as this. It says, "Look, Daddy, we already know how to suck," which I'm sorry to even say that because it's terrible. A picture of a couple of underage girls. Now, many people would probably argue that this is a joke or whatever, but the point is that this page was very much about all underage girl profiles with very sexual connotations just like this. And this account is still very much active, while Twitter's purging accounts of probably Russian bots and people that speak their mind. So take that into account when you're considering what's really going on today with things like my website going down and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube constantly censoring and suppressing content they deem fake news while allowing stuff like this to remain. Let that set in for a moment and be sure and spread that around because, frankly, it absolutely disgusts me. So for the first article of the day, coming from activistnews.com, I'm sorry, I said this last time, activistpost.com, written by Brandon Turbeville. It's entitled, "After U.S., UK, France Bomb Syria, OPCW Report Contradicts Claims of Irrefutable Proof of Chemical Weapons." Now, this is one that I've talked about already. And it's something that I think is very, very, very important to continue to put out there, if for no other reason that it got absolutely no coverage in the mainstream media. Really, if you consider that for a moment, had it got, well, I should point out, obviously, in some of the mainstream media channels, I should say, many of the publications, some of them actually did put stuff out, which we know was wildly incorrect. And they actually had to retract the titles and change what they put out. However, they got zero attention. Now think about if it had come with the opposite information. They would have immediately, we wouldn't hear the end of it. That would be all they talked about for the next week. Yet now it's the other side and it's crickets from the main mainstream channels, Fox and CNN. And you would think someone like Fox would absolutely want to discuss something like this. But of course, when it comes to the war agenda and actual U.S. foreign policy, it's crickets from all of them. And it's a very important story to cover. But the real point of this article in particular is essentially that he really drives home the point that the United States, France, and the UK bombed Syria on the verge of World War III, essentially, an unprecedented act for really a long time in the world geopolitical scene, openly attacked Syria and claimed they had, quote, irrefutable proof of chemical weapons. Then this report comes out and completely contradicts that. So, and now what the interesting kind of dynamic here is that, I find it kind of macabrely humorous that they report this when it comes out wrong, right? We saw The Guardian, all these people, Reuters, come out claiming proof of chemical gas. The mainstream media fell all over themselves to use this incorrectly. Again, proof of chemical gas, then retracted those claims, changed their headlines. I call that a retraction because we don't see retractions today. And then the independent media, such as myself, comes out and correctly states what the findings were. No proof of sarin gas, no proof thus far of chlorine gas used. And that's exactly what the report stated. And what I find incredibly funny is they come out and claim proof of chlorine gas and then retract it. And then we come out and say what they actually find. They say, whoa, let's wait for the full finding to come out. It just shows you how absurdly hypocritical and ridiculous these people are. That they're willing to jump on anything and point to what they think. But the moment we try to say our side, actually based on the facts, we are jumping the gun. Whoa, we should wait for the, the not preliminary report, which is exactly what they did in reverse, based on the wrong information. I just find this incredibly important to drive home. And again, to come back to his original point, that ultimately they bombed another country, a sovereign nation that they're currently illegally occupying, based on so-called irrefutable proof that now we know didn't exist. Otherwise, it would have been in the preliminary report. And that preliminary report completely contradicts any claims they even pretended to have for bombing that country. Now, truly let that set in about the kind of people we're talking about today in regard to all of the other things we're discussing. It's truly horrifying to think about. Moving on to the next story coming from the antimedia.com, and another very important one that I've talked about a lot so far. Saudi Arabia issues royal pardon for everything soldiers have done in Yemen. Now, this is one that is just absolutely horrifying. You guys know I've talked about Yemen a lot and what's going on there. And the reality that this could even take place should truly disgust all of us. And it's really one of those concepts that's just, it's not just hypocritical, it's just atrocious. And it's something that obviously continues to get no coverage, this nor the actual actions taking place there. But it's one that I absolutely believe we should continue to spread as much as possible because it is truly that horrifying. Now, on Tuesday, Saudi Arabia announced that it is issuing a royal pardon for any and all Saudi troops engaged in the war in Yemen, covering all crimes related to violating military rules and discipline. All crimes. They said this is to show appreciation for the, quote, heroics of the invading forces. Now, clearly just blatant propaganda. But the gall it takes to say something like that in the face of such horrendous and generally acknowledged by the international community, horrendous human rights violations and outright genocide, to call it heroics of the invading forces, which is almost contradictory when they say they're pardoning the violation of their rules and discipline, yet they're heroics. How that comes together, I don't know, but it just frustrates me to see this. Saudi airstrikes have killed massive numbers of Yemeni civilians, and the war has also caused a famine, as you all know, and the largest cholera epidemic in human history due to their blockade and the U.S.-backed coalition actions ongoing there. Faced with UN criticism, Saudi officials heavily resisted allegations of wrongdoing and ultimately got the UN to agree that Saudi Arabia would be allowed to investigate its own forces and actually police themselves, which truly speaks to the actual nature of the UN on one end. That's something we have to continue to understand. As much as their information can be analyzed and discussed, when it comes down to it, the ultimate institution itself is run by the very people and will run or actually have veto power over everything that happens by the very people that allow these things to carry on. Now, this pardon, however, shows no such investigation is going on at all. Like there wasn't any kind of a faux investigation. They simply just said, you're all pardoned, investigation over. This is what we're really dealing with today. And all this actually, while Amnesty International is currently calling for a probe into U.S.-backed coalition actions and the use of torture in black site prisons. This is such a disgusting story, and it appalls me to think that this kind of thing is not getting any attention, and the fact that this is a U.S. ally. This is the person that we're allied with today. As Americans, our tax dollars and our money and our votes are helping people like this, while the government continues to point the finger at countries that probably have their own demons to sow as well, but arguably much less than what we're looking at in regard to places like Israel and Saudi Arabia. It's truly horrifying, something I continue to drive home, and I will continue to until I see people actually hold them accountable, and the government and, just generally the media, I would argue, say something about this. But I won't hold my breath. Moving on to the next story coming from mintpressnews.com, entitled Human Rights Violations by Saudi Coalition Mercenaries Spark Mass Mobilization of Volunteer Fighters to Yemen's southwest. The Saudi-led coalition, unable to secure control of the strategic port city of Hodeidah, has recently flooded the cities and towns surrounding Hodeidah with foreign and indigenous mercenaries. That sounds familiar. Hoping to bring the port city to its knees by taking control of the surrounding region. Now, while this is happening, while they're hiring mercenaries and extremists to flood the area that they're having trouble controlling to bring them to their knees, huge numbers of Yemeni residents, civilians, sparked by ongoing human rights violations, have responded by taking to the battlefield in the largest draw of volunteer fighters since the U.S.-backed Saudi coalition began its offensive on the strategic port of Hodeidah 3 weeks ago. A Houthi military field commander told Mint Press News that over 5,000 fighters have mobilized, and an additional 3,000 are on standby. Now, we have to understand, this is not Saudi Arabia fighting Iran in Yemen, as it's constantly forced by the mainstream media and the Western powers. This is literally, we're witnessing the civilian population rising up to stop the invasion of the U.S.-backed Saudi forces. This is something we have to recognize, to stop them from taking their homes, rising up as the civilian people, just as any one of us would, should a foreign invader try to seize our hometown. Just reflect on that for a moment and realize what's really going on there. And I continue to say these things in hopes that the few people that may be tuning in that aren't aware of this already may be shook free from the mainstream propaganda, as I know most of you are already well aware of this. But it's horrifying to realize this. The same thing we're talking about with the Palestinians being kicked from their homes. We're literally watching these civilians so struck with human rights violations and plagued with famine and cholera and all these horrendous things that are literally rising up in the midst of all of this to fight the Saudis, and actually doing a good job of it. As it turns out, they're actually basically massacring the Saudi invasion in Hodeidah right now, which is pretty embarrassing for the U.S.-led Saudi coalition. I find that pretty humorous that these people are actually out to murder the civilian population and they're not doing a good enough job, which is a fantastic thing to hear. But it doesn't mean they're going to ultimately win out because they have backed by people like the United States. However, it's absolutely horrendous to see this, that the civilian population even have to pick up guns and stand against such a force. But it's important to get this information out there and realize what's really going on. And I think it's incredibly important to realize this use of mercenaries and extremist forces as a way of taking the battlefield for themselves. And it's something that we see in a lot of different places, such as Syria. Something that we'll get into in the next story that's been happening for a very long time. That's basically the go-to operation for U.S. interventionism by hiring and using extremist forces they pretend to be fighting to basically turn the civilian population against its own government, and it basically just destabilize the government to the point where they can easily invade, which is a disgusting thing to think about. Again, with our money and our votes, this is what's happening. Moving on to the next story, and the final story of the day, coming from Global Research, the war on Syria, driving home the truth and the need to act now. Now, this is one that I would argue many of you in there are already aware of what this is about and understand this information, but there's far too many, and this is the overall point of this article, that either ignore this information or simply have not even been presented with it for some ridiculous reason, obviously because the mainstream media refuses to even touch something like this. The war on Syria is remarkable on many levels. One of those levels is the success of Western propagandists to prevent the truth from attaining widespread acceptance. The truth has always been available, but rarely accepted, even when admissions of culpability in the highest of crimes come from credible Western sources. What would be more damning than open admissions? Similarly, reputable researchers confirmed long ago what broad-based Western audiences still refuse to accept. This next quote coming from Professor Michael Chossudovsky. I hope I'm not murdering his name. He's an excellent journalist. He writes for, has an integral part in the globalresearch.ca. And he said his quote, "The Islamic State was and continues to be supported covertly by the United States. In other words, the Islamic State is a creation of U.S. intelligence with the support of Britain's MI6, Israel's Mossad, Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence, and Saudi Arabia's General Intelligence Presidency. Moreover, there is evidence that NATO, in liaison with the Turkish High Command, has been involved in the recruitment of jihadist mercenaries from the onset of the Syrian crisis in March 2011. In relation to the Syrian insurgency, the Islamic State fighters, together with al-Qaeda-affiliated jihadist forces of the al-Nusra Front, are the foot soldiers of the Western military alliance. They are covertly supported by U.S., NATO, Israel. Their mandate is to wage a terrorist insurgency against the government of Bashar al-Assad. The atrocities committed by the Islamic State in Iraq are similar to those committed in Syria." Now, that's something that is completely 100% backed up by actual evidence. And the point he makes in this article is that something that people continue to ignore and look the other way. On-the-ground evidence of liberated areas continues to reveal the monstrous crimes of the West terrorist proxies and continues to demonstrate the ongoing culpability of the West in the highest of international crimes. What could be more straightforward than that? Perhaps what is missing is another large truth. Nobody except a tiny transnational oligarchy class benefits from all of this death and misery. And the benefits accrued to this parasitical class are all short-term anyway. All of the public monies that the Pentagon and the military-industrial complexes of a host of nations, including Canada, are siphoning from the masses serves to impoverish all but the elites. Much of North America is being increasingly third-worldized, which is exactly what we talked about yesterday. And this is something that is happening willingly. Professor James Petraeus said, quote, billions in the arms industry and security mercenary conglomerates receive over $700 billion from the federal budget, which is actually over $1 trillion when you count black budget, while over 100 million U.S. workers lack adequate health care and their children are warehoused in deteriorating schools. Sounds very familiar to what I point out on a regular basis. And maybe these obscured realities will help drive home the point that the West's current trajectory of globalized war and poverty need to be terminated now. Now, that's something I think is very important to let resonate, something that we continue to talk about on a regular basis. But the reality that this information is all right there. This is not hard to find. There's mountains of evidence to support everything we just said. Yet so many people will still balk at the fact that the U.S. is in any way associated with these kind of extremist groups, even knowing that they've admitted to arming extremist moderate rebels, yet balk at the fact that they were in any way involved with ISIS. Yet we know that they armed, created, and funded Al-Qaeda to fight the USSR, that then became ISIS. Yet still, people will willingly ignore the facts. And there's a reason for that. I mean, social programming is such a massive effort underway today. But it's continually frustrating that people will actively ignore what truly shows the nature of the very people that are supposedly, in some cases, people argue, fighting the deep state, and that we're supposed to just trust them and hope that they lead us into a new age of freedom. But the reality is, it's all going the same direction. It's all increasingly getting worse. So all we can continue to do is point this out, talk about it, take actions to bring attention to all of these things in hopes that maybe more people in the world will begin to recognize that what's going on today is not in our name. It's not something that I support. I don't know about you. Maybe it's not something you support. If not, say something about it. Start a YouTube channel. Get out there and create something. Reach out to me and you can join something that I'm taking part in. The reality is we cannot sit idly by and allow these things to continue. Otherwise, in some ways, it makes us complicit. But that's something that's very hard for many to wrap their minds around. I truly love all of you and I appreciate you tuning in today. And I'll make sure and do some more long ones coming up soon and really appreciate your interaction and everything you're doing. Please feel free to reach out and touch base with me if you'd like to get involved in any way. Make sure you check out our Patreon page. Even $1 a day goes an extremely long way, but just simply sharing the video means everything to me. For more information on the topics discussed, make sure you check out thelastamericanvagabond.com in hopes that the site's actually not down today, and it will continue to make sure that stays up for you, and as well as any of the important independent sources in the show notes below. And as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.